One night can undo 10 years of marriage. One secret can outlive the woman who kept it. And one lifetime is sometimes not enough to pay back what was taken in a single evening by candlelight. This is the story of a woman who was declared a poisoner, a madwoman, and a corpse, and who let every one of those lies stand, just long enough to bury the people who told them. Stay until the end. You will want to see their faces when the truth walks back through the front door. The carriage lamps of Marrowgate Hall were still being lit when a woman in a plain wool cloak came walking up the servants' lane from the village, and the 2 footmen who passed her with an empty cart did not so much as glance at her face. Rain had fallen earlier that afternoon and had frozen into a thin, treacherous glaze upon the gravel, and she walked over it carefully, the way a woman walks who has learned, in a hard season, that a fall costs more than time. Behind her, the great house rose up out of the dusk with every window blazing, for tonight was Lady Isolde Ashworth's wedding, and Marrowgate had not seen so many candles lit at once since the night, 3 years before, when the same house had watched its own Duchess dragged out through those same doors in disgrace, screaming her innocence to a crowd of guests who had already decided, gladly, not to believe her. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you don't lose this story halfway through, and ring the little bell so the next one finds you too. And down in the comments, tell me one secret you have carried longer than you meant to, not the contents of it, just how long. Now come with me up the servants' lane, past the frozen gravel, and let us find out who is hiding beneath that plain wool cloak. Her name, when she had last worn it publicly, had been Seraphine Ashworth, Duchess of Marrowgate. Before that, for 20 years, it had been Seraphine Duval, only surviving daughter of Josiah Duval, master of the Duval trading house of Colmore, a firm so old and so quietly enormous that half the noble houses of the realm had, at one time or another, borrowed against its credit without ever admitting it aloud. She was 27 years old now, though the last 3 years had taken more out of her face than the 24 before them combined, and the world, or at least the small, glittering, self-satisfied portion of the world that called itself Marrowgate society, believed her either mad or fled or dead, depending on which version of the story a person preferred to tell at dinner. She had been 19 when she married Rowan Ashworth, 7th Duke of Marrowgate, a tall, gentle, scholarly man 11 years her elder who collected old star charts and forgot, with endearing regularity, to eat his breakfast before it went cold. She had married him for love, which had scandalized both families equally, since the Ashworths considered trade beneath them and the Duvals considered the aristocracy a slow-moving disaster waiting to happen. And for 7 years the marriage had proven both families half right and half wrong in exactly the proportion such marriages usually do. Rowan loved her without ever quite learning how to protect her. And that, in the end, had been the whole of the tragedy. The trouble had begun, as trouble in great houses so often does, with a woman who wanted what her brother had, and a mother who wanted it more than she did. Lady Isolde Ashworth was 22 on the night this story truly starts, 3 years before the wedding, now blazing with candlelight above the frozen gravel. She was golden-haired, quick-tongued, and possessed of the particular beauty that makes a room reorganize itself gently around wherever she happens to be standing. She had adored her older brother Rowan with the fierce, uncomplicated love of a much younger sibling right up until the day Seraphine Duval walked into Marrowgate on his arm, at which point the adoration curdled, slowly and almost without Isolde noticing it herself, into something colder and far more patient. It was not, she would have said if pressed, that she disliked Seraphine. It was only that a trade merchant's daughter had somehow become the mistress of the house that Isolde had grown up believing would one day, in some vague and comfortable way, still belong a little to her. And behind Isolde stood her mother, the Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth, Rowan's father's second wife and Isolde's own natural mother, a tall, ash-pale woman with a talent for stillness so complete that servants swore she could stand in a doorway for an hour without a single fold of her morning silk stirring. Vesper had married the 6th Duke for his title and had discovered, 3 years into the marriage, that the title came attached to a set of debts so old and so deep that the whole estate groaned under them like a ship taking on water. Rowan's marriage to Seraphine Duval had, in one stroke and much to Vesper's private fury, solved a problem Vesper had spent a decade trying to solve on her own terms, for the Duval fortune, once married into the family, could quietly and respectably prop up the Ashworth name for another 2 generations. Vesper had smiled at the wedding. She had smiled at every anniversary since. It was, everyone agreed, remarkable how warmly the Dowager had welcomed a daughter-in-law of trade. What almost no one at Marrowgate knew, what Seraphine herself did not learn until the night everything broke apart, was that Vesper's warmth toward the Duval fortune had a history considerably older and considerably darker than her son's marriage. Seraphine had once had a younger sister, Marguerite Duval, gentle and dreamy and 4 years her junior, who had married at 18 into a lesser noble house allied by old friendship to the Ashworths, the house of Calverley, and who had died 2 years later of what the physicians called a wasting fever, in a manor 40 miles from Marrowgate, attended in her final weeks by a nurse whom the Dowager Duchess Vesper had personally recommended and personally paid. Seraphine had grieved her sister the way anyone grieves an early death that no one can quite explain, with a sorrow that dulls but does not resolve. She had not, in 7 years of marriage, ever once suspected that her sister's dowry, a considerable sum drawn originally from the Duval trading house, had, upon Marguerite's death without issue, reverted not to the Calverleys as the marriage contract plainly stated, but by a quietly altered codicil to a trust administered at one further remove, by the Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth herself, under an arrangement so old and so carefully buried in Calverley paperwork that it had taken Seraphine 7 years of marriage and one very particular evening to stumble across it entirely by accident. That evening was the 10th anniversary of Rowan and Seraphine's wedding, celebrated with a masquerade ball so large that Marrowgate had to open wings of the house that had stood shuttered since the 6th Duke's funeral. 300 guests came in silk and feathers and gilded half-masks, and the orchestra played until the small hours, and it was, by every account given afterward, a beautiful evening right up until it wasn't. The ball itself had been, in the hours before it turned, precisely the sort of evening Marrowgate had not seen in a generation. 300 guests moved through rooms strung with hothouse jasmine grown specially for the occasion in glass frames along the south wall, and the orchestra, brought up from the capital at considerable expense, had played a set of new dances that half the county's dowagers pronounced scandalous and every one of their daughters privately adored. Seraphine had worn a mask of pale silver feathers that night, chosen to match nothing in particular except her own eyes, and Rowan had worn, at her gentle insistence, a mask shaped like an owl, because she had once told him, early in their courtship, that he watched the world the way an owl watches a field, patiently, and missing nothing that mattered, and he had laughed and kept the joke alive for 10 years running. She remembered thinking, as she crossed the ballroom floor near 11 o'clock past clusters of laughing guests she had known for a decade, that she had never in her life felt so entirely certain she had built something worth keeping. She would return to that certainty often in the years that followed, the way a person returns again and again to the last clear photograph of a face before everything in it changed. Seraphine had gone up to the old estate office near midnight to fetch a ledger of household accounts that Rowan, distracted as ever by a guest who wanted to discuss comet tables, had asked her to bring down for a wager he'd made with a visiting astronomer about the cost of a particular telescope purchased decades before. She had not expected to find, tucked behind that ledger in a drawer that had not been opened in years, a slim bundle of correspondence between the Dowager Duchess and a solicitor in Calverley, tied with a faded green ribbon and sealed, absurdly, with the same wax stamp Vesper used on her personal letters even now. She had read 3 pages of it standing in the cold estate office with the masquerade music seeping faintly through the floor beneath her slippers, and by the 3rd page her hands had gone entirely numb, and not from the cold. The letters spoke, in the careful oblique language of people who know exactly how damning their own words would look if read by the wrong eyes, of an arrangement made shortly before Marguerite Calverley's final illness, regarding the disposition of certain trust moneys in the event of the young lady's death without an heir. They spoke of a nurse engaged at considerable private expense. They spoke, in one line that Seraphine would recite to herself every night for the next 3 years without ever managing to make it hurt less, of how fortunate it was, in the strictest financial sense, that dear Marguerite had proven so delicate a creature. Seraphine had not screamed. She had not wept, not then. She had sat down very slowly in her husband's father's old chair, the ledger still unfetched upon the shelf, the letters spread before her upon the blotting paper, and she had begun, in the cold, methodical way her own father had trained into her since childhood, to understand precisely what she was looking at, and precisely what it would cost the woman who had written it. She did not get the chance to finish that understanding in private. Isolde found her there 20 minutes later, having come up ostensibly to fetch a shawl, and had seen, in the single unguarded instant before Seraphine could gather the letters away, exactly what her sister-in-law was holding. What passed between the 2 women in the estate office that night, no servant ever heard and no guest ever witnessed, but within the hour, down in the crowded, candlelit ballroom, Rowan Ashworth collapsed suddenly at the punch table, his face gray, his breath shallow, froth at the corner of his mouth, and a physician summoned from among the guests pronounced, within minutes and with considerable alarm, that the Duke had been poisoned. The wine glass nearest his hand, it was discovered, loudly, publicly, and with remarkable speed, bore traces of a rare and costly northern nightshade extract, the very same extract. It further emerged with equally remarkable speed, that a chambermaid swore under oath to having seen the Duchess purchase from an apothecary in the capital not 4 weeks prior, ostensibly for a headache remedy. A second chambermaid, weeping and wringing her hands, testified that she had found a small glass vial, half empty, hidden inside the Duchess's own jewelry case that very evening while laying out her mistress's masks. The Dowager Duchess Vesper, white with horror, wondered aloud, in a voice that carried perfectly to every corner of the stunned ballroom, whether the Duchess's strange, sudden interest in old family correspondence that very night, for hadn't she, been seen going up to the estate office alone, might not have some darker purpose behind it than anyone had yet imagined. Perhaps, the Dowager suggested gently, so gently, the poor Duchess had grown unwell in her mind. Grief for a lost sister could do strange things to a woman's reason, over enough years. By morning Rowan Ashworth had not died. The physicians, working through the night, had purged the poison from him with a violence that left him weak as a newborn for a month afterward. But he had also not once, in the first raw days of his recovery, been permitted by his mother and his sister to speak alone with his wife, and by the time he was strong enough to insist upon it, Seraphine was already 3 days gone from Marrowgate, taken in the dead of night by 2 of the Dowager's own men to a remote hunting lodge in the northern hills that the Ashworth family kept for exactly this purpose, and quietly, efficiently, without any magistrate ever troubling to ask a second question, declared unfit, by reason of a mind broken with grief and jealousy, to remain in her husband's house or at liberty in society. Her son Theo, not yet 3 years old, was kept at Marrowgate under his grandmother's care. Her husband, half poisoned and wholly bewildered, was told, gently and repeatedly, by the 2 women who loved him least honestly in the world, that his wife had tried to kill him, and that it was a mercy truly, that she had been removed before she could try again. Seraphine did not, in fact, lose her mind at the hunting lodge in the northern hills. What she lost over the following 11 months was almost everything else: her son, her husband's trust, her place in the only home she had made as a grown woman, and very nearly her life for the lodge's aging caretaker, a widow named Audley Marsh, who had been quietly paid to keep her prisoner comfortable and silent, found her one gray March morning burning with a fever so severe that the old woman genuinely believed, for 2 days running, that she was tending a deathbed rather than a captivity. She did not die. Audley Marsh, who had buried a husband and 2 sons of her own to lesser fevers than this, sat up with Seraphine through both of those 2 days, and on the 3rd morning, when the fever broke at last and Seraphine opened her eyes clear and lucid for the first time in nearly a week, the old widow looked down at her with the particular flat, assessing gaze of a woman who has spent 40 years deciding, quickly, who around her can be trusted, and asked her, without any preamble at all, whether it was true what the Dowager's man had told her when he paid her, that the Duchess had tried to poison her own husband. Seraphine, weak as water, her dark hair damp with fever sweat against the pillow, had looked back at the old woman for a long moment, and had then told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, the entire truth, of the letters in the green ribbon, of her dead sister's dowry quietly diverted into the Dowager's private trust, of the poison that had appeared in her jewelry case the very night she had found those letters, planted there by hands she had not seen but could guess at well enough. Audley Marsh had listened without once interrupting, and when Seraphine finished, the old woman had risen, banked the fire, and said only, in the flat voice of a person for whom loyalty is a practical matter and not a sentimental one, that she had buried better men than the Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth for far less, and that she supposed she would be needing a very great deal more silver than the Dowager was currently paying her if she was going to help a duchess disappear from under that woman's nose. It took 4 more months for Seraphine to recover her strength, gather what proof she could smuggle out through Audley's few trusted contacts in the hill villages, and arrange, through a single careful letter carried 3 days' ride to the offices of the Duval trading house in Colmore, into the hands of her father's oldest surviving partner, a lean, silver-haired man named Elias Fenn, who had known her since she was a child writing on the counting-house floor. The beginning of a case that a court would one day be forced to hear whether the Ashworth family wished it heard or not. Elias Fenn had wept, the one time in her life Seraphine ever saw him do so, when he read that first letter by lamplight in his own study, for he had known Josiah Duval for 40 years and had carried his coffin himself, and he told Seraphine, when at last he trusted his voice again, that her father had always said the Ashworth marriage would either be the making or the undoing of the family fortune, and that he had never once imagined it would be both at once. From that night forward, Fen became to Seraphine what her father had once been to the counting house. A patient, exacting mind against which she could test every plan before she risked it in the world. He arranged, quietly and at his own expense, for Audley Marsh's cottage to be supplied through the worst of the following winter under the guise of a wool merchant's charity. He arranged, more delicately still, for a private investigator of impeccable discretion to be sent north to the Calverley estate to make careful, unhurried inquiries about a nurse who might, perhaps, still be found somewhere in the county, should anyone trouble to look. It took another 2 years beyond that for the proof to become undeniable, for witnesses to be found and quietly protected, for a second nurse who had attended Marguerite Calverley in her final illness to be located, still living, still frightened, and finally, after 2 years of careful persuasion and one very large sum of Duval money set aside for her family's safety, still willing to speak. Seraphine spent the better part of those 2 years not in the hunting lodge from which Audley helped her slip away entirely in the autumn of the first year, but in a rented room above a grain merchant's shop in Colmore, 3 streets from the Duval counting house, living under the name of a widowed governess and working, some nights until dawn, cross-referencing Calverley household accounts against Ashworth trust ledgers by candlelight, line by line, the way her father had once taught her, to find the single false entry hidden inside 100 true ones. She wrote to her son twice a year, letters she never dared send, and kept them instead in a locked box beneath her floorboards, so that one day, if the day ever came, he might read them and know that his mother had not forgotten him for a single one of the 1100 nights she had spent away from him. And so it was that on the night of Lady Isolde Ashworth's wedding to Lord Aubrey Senet, 3 years almost to the day since the masquerade ball that had ended with a duke poisoned and a duchess dragged away in disgrace, a woman in a plain wool cloak walked up the frozen gravel of the servants' lane toward Marrowgate Hall, and slipped in through the kitchen door precisely as the head cook, red-faced and overwhelmed by 300 wedding guests, was shouting for someone, anyone, to carry the second round of wine up to the long gallery before the toasts began. The uniform Seraphine wore beneath the cloak had been provided, at no small risk to herself, by a kitchen maid named Ivy Marsh, Audley's own grandniece, who had taken a position at Marrowgate 2 years before at Seraphine's careful arrangement and had waited, patiently and silently, for exactly this night to arrive. Ivy pressed a tray of wine glasses into Seraphine's hands in the scullery passage, glanced once at her face beneath the plain white cap, and whispered only that the family was gathered now in the long gallery for the pre-toast reception, and that the Duke, meaning Rowan, had grown so thin these last years that Ivy scarcely recognized him some mornings, and that little Lord Theo, 5 years old now, had been brought down for the ceremony in a suit of blue velvet and looked, Ivy said, so like his mother about the eyes that it near broke her heart to dress him for it. Seraphine took the tray. She did not trust her voice enough to answer. She climbed the back stair to the long gallery, and she stepped into the crowd of 300 silk-clad guests exactly as she had stepped into a crowd once before, invisible, uncounted, a tray between her and the world, and she began once more to listen. She heard, within the first quarter hour, 2 matrons of the county remarking to one another how remarkably well the family had recovered from that dreadful business 3 years past, and how it only proved, didn't it, that some women simply could not bear the strain of a great house, poor thing, though of course one did wonder what had become of her, out in the hills somewhere, presumably if she still lived at all. She heard a young lord ask another, in the careless voice of a man discussing horseflesh, whether it was true that Lady Isolde's new husband, Lord Senet, had been rather insistent upon a generous marriage settlement drawn from the Ashworth Trust, and heard the answer, delivered with a small knowing laugh, that the trust had grown considerably fatter these last 3 years, hadn't it, once certain? Here the young lord's voice dropped, delicately. Certain complications had been resolved. She heard, a little further on, an older gentleman of the county remark to his wife, over a plate of iced cake, that he had always thought it a great pity about the young Duchess, whatever had truly happened to her, since she had been the only Ashworth in a generation who had ever troubled to remember his own late daughter's birthday, and his wife had shushed him quickly, glancing about the gallery as though the very mention of the missing Duchess might summon some ill luck upon the wedding. And the old gentleman had subsided, grumbling, into his cake, unaware that the woman he pitied stood not 4 paces from his elbow with a tray of wine glasses in her steady hands. It was as she turned from that conversation, tray still balanced before her, that she found herself very nearly face to face with Mr. Aldous Penrose, the steward the Dowager Duchess had installed at Marrowgate 2 years into Seraphine's marriage, over the quiet objections of the old housekeeper who had served the family since Rowan's boyhood and who had, not coincidentally, been pensioned off within the month. Penrose was a narrow, watchful man who prided himself, loudly and often, on never forgetting a face that had once crossed his ledgers, and he stopped now in the gallery doorway and looked at Seraphine for a long moment with his head tilted slightly, the way a man looks at a word on a page that he is almost, but not quite, able to read. She lowered her eyes at once, dipped the small deferential curtsy of a hired girl brought in for the night's extra work, and murmured, in the flattened country vowels she had spent 3 years training into her voice for exactly this possibility, that the head cook had sent her up with the second wine before the toasts. Penrose grunted, told her sharply not to dawdle in the gallery gawking at her betters, and turned back toward the dining hall to see that the tables were set, and Seraphine let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and walked on, tray steady, cap low, toward the fireplace where the family waited. She moved on through the crowd with her tray, and she came at last to the great marble fireplace at the far end of the gallery, where the family had gathered to receive congratulations, and there she saw them arranged exactly as she had known, in the cold certainty of 3 years' planning, that she would find them. Rowan stood nearest the fire, thinner than she remembered, his dark hair threaded now with gray at the temples though he could not yet be 40, his eyes carrying the particular hollowed patience of a man who has stopped expecting good news and has trained himself instead to be merely grateful for the absence of bad. Beside him, small and solemn in his blue velvet suit, stood Theo, and Seraphine's hands very nearly betrayed her on the tray at the sight of him, for Ivy had been right. The boy had her own gray eyes exactly, and her own way of standing very still and watching a room before speaking in it, and she had missed 3 years of watching that stillness grow into him, and she felt the missing of it like a physical wound beneath her ribs. Beyond them stood Isolde, radiant in bridal white and diamonds that had, Seraphine happened to know precisely, been drawn from a jewelry case that had once been her own, and beside Isolde, tall and pale and utterly composed in grey-watered silk, stood the Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth, who had aged in 3 years not at all, as though cruelty of a sufficiently patient and well-managed kind cost a woman nothing whatsoever in the way of complexion. Seraphine came to a stop 3 respectful paces behind them, tray extended, cap low over her brow, and she offered wine that neither the Dowager nor the new Lady Senate troubled to notice was being offered by anyone in particular, and she listened. Vesper was speaking in the low, contented murmur of a woman surveying a project brought at last to satisfactory completion, of how pleasant it would be, now that Isolde was so well settled, to turn her own remaining attention fully to young Theo's upbringing, since the boy would need, in time, a firmer guiding hand than his father's distracted scholarship could provide, and since— here her voice dropped further, and Seraphine had to lean nearly imperceptibly closer to catch it, since it would be prudent, surely, given the unfortunate history of the boy's mother's side of the family, to begin quietly reviewing whether the Duval trading interests still nominally held in trust for the child ought not, in fairness to the stability of the Ashworth name, be more directly administered from Marrowgate itself, rather than left to that stubborn old partner in Calmore who had proven, Vesper said with faint distaste, so tiresomely difficult to persuade these 3 years past. Isolde, adjusting a diamond at her throat, murmured her agreement, and added, in a voice pitched for her mother's ear alone, that it was almost a pity the fever in the hills 3 winters back had not finished what the wine-glass started, since a death by natural causes would have spared them all this 3 years of tiresome legal correspondence with Calmore over trust moneys that ought, by rights, to have settled the moment the madwoman was declared unfit. Seraphine, 3 paces behind them with a tray of wine, did not move. She did not breathe. She let the words fall into her the way snow falls onto still water, without a ripple, and she thought of Ottilie Marsh sitting up 2 nights running at a fever's bedside, and she thought of 3 years of careful, patient, unglamorous work, depositions gathered, a frightened nurse persuaded, ledgers cross-referenced against Calverley accounts line by candlelight in a rented room above a Calmore grain merchant's shop, and she felt something in her chest settle, finally and completely, into a stillness of its own, a stillness she recognized as the twin of the one she had first felt, 3 years before, sitting in a cold estate office with a bundle of letters and a green ribbon spread before her on the blotting paper. She lowered the tray a fraction of an inch, in silent acknowledgement of the 2 women who had just, for the second time in 3 years, confessed everything that mattered to a servant they had never once bothered to see. Then she turned and she walked back through the gallery, past 300 guests drinking wine she had once ordered by the case herself, and she went to find her son. What Seraphine did not yet know, standing 3 paces from the fireplace with her tray of wine, was how thoroughly those 3 years had also unmade the man she had married. Rowan Ashworth had spent the first winter after her removal writing letters, to physicians, to magistrates, to the hunting lodge itself, asking only to see his wife, to hear from her own mouth whether the things his mother told him were true, and every letter had come back to him unanswered, or answered by his mother's own hand assuring him that the Duchess was too unwell for visitors and improving only slowly, if at all. He had ridden north himself twice, in defiance of Vesper's soft, endless counsel that the strain of seeing him might undo what fragile recovery the poor Duchess had managed, and both times he had been turned away at the lodge gate by Ottilie Marsh herself, who had looked him in the eye with an old woman's flat, unreadable patience and told him only that his wife was sleeping and could not be woken, which was, in the strictest sense, not entirely a lie, since Seraphine had made Ottilie swear on the one occasion she dared risk a visit at all, never to let her husband see her until she could come to him whole, with proof in her hand instead of only grief in her face, for she could not bear the thought of him remembering her, if their story ended badly, as the broken woman in the lodge rather than the wife who had once crossed a ballroom floor toward him in a mask of silver feathers. Rowan had not understood this refusal in those years as anything but confirmation of what his mother told him, that his wife's mind had turned against him entirely, and he had grieved her, in the strange suspended way one grieves a person who is not dead but also not reachable, for 3 long years, growing thinner and quieter and grayer at the temples, until even his own sister remarked, not unkindly, that he had begun to look rather more like a widower than a husband whose wife had simply gone away. She found Theo a half-hour later, alone for a moment near the gallery's tall windows, having wandered from the receiving line while the adults exchanged another round of congratulations, and she knelt before him as she had once knelt before another child in another great house's crowded hall, and she said softly that she had heard he was very fond of the stars, like his father. Theo, gray-eyed and grave, said that he was, and that his father had a whole room full of star charts, and that his father was sad a great deal, though he tried not to let anyone see it, and that his father sometimes called him by the wrong name in the evenings, a name Theo did not know, though he had once asked his grandmother about it and been told sharply never to ask again. He looked up at the servant kneeling before him with her cap low over her brow, and something in his small solemn face shifted, slowly, the way a child's face shifts when a half-buried memory surfaces without quite reaching words, and he said very quietly that she smelled like the soap his old nurse used to use before the new nurse came, and that he did not remember much from before, but that he remembered someone used to read to him about a duchess who lived under the sea and was very brave, and never afraid of anything, and he did not know why he was telling a servant this, except that her eyes made him think of it. Seraphine's hands, steady through 3 years of hunger and fever and grief, trembled once, badly, upon the tray. She said, in a voice she fought to keep low and even, that it sounded like a very good story, and that brave duchesses were not always afraid, even when they had every reason to be, and that sometimes they simply waited, very patiently, for exactly the right moment to come home. Theo considered this with the enormous seriousness of a 5-year-old weighing an idea too large for him, and then he nodded, and said that he hoped she came home soon, whoever she was, because his father needed her, and then a nursemaid called his name from across the gallery and he trotted off obediently, and Seraphine knelt alone by the tall windows for one long moment with her tray forgotten on the sill, before she rose, straightened her cap and went back to work. The toasts began an hour later, in the grand dining hall, where the wedding party and its 300 guests had gathered beneath chandeliers that Seraphine herself had once chosen the candles for. Lord Senate's own solicitor, a thin dry man named Mr. Corliss Ray, rose to read, as county custom dictated for a match of such standing, a brief formal statement of the marriage settlements agreed between the two houses, before the more private legal business would be concluded the following week in the capital. He spoke of the Senate contribution to the joint estate, considerable and long anticipated. He spoke, with the particular careful phrasing of a lawyer who has been paid well to phrase things carefully, of the Ashworth contribution drawn, in significant part, from certain trust moneys whose administration had, he noted delicately, been under thorough and welcome review these past 3 years, and which the Dowager Duchess had graciously undertaken to see fully and finally settled under direct Ashworth stewardship before the year's end. It was at this precise moment, 17 minutes into Mr. Ray's reading, that the sound arrived which Seraphine had been waiting 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days to hear. It came first as a stir among the footmen at the great doors, and then as raised voices in the entrance hall beyond, and then, unmistakably, as the brisk, deliberate ring of boots on marble, many boots, moving in the ordered rhythm of men who did not intend to be stopped by anyone's steward. Mr. Ray faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned. The Dowager Duchess Vesper rose halfway from her chair, her composure, for the first time in 3 years, visibly cracking at its edges, and a footman burst through the dining hall doors, white-faced, to announce, in a voice that shook rather badly, the arrival of Mr. Elias Fenn, senior partner of the Duval Trading House of Calmore, accompanied by the Crown's own circuit magistrate, Sir Alden Marchpane, and by a deputation of officers bearing warrants concerning the estates and person of the late Marguerite Calverley née Duval. The room did not so much fall silent as forget, collectively, how to make sound. Seraphine set down her tray upon a side table with the same great care she had once used to set down a tray of biscuits in a different house, so that no glass so much as clicked against another. She reached up. She drew the white cap from her head, and her dark hair fell loose about her shoulders in the long heavy fall that 3 years of hardship had silvered faintly at one temple, a single pale streak that had not been there the last time this room had seen her face. She untied the plain servant's apron at her waist and let it drop, and beneath it she stood in a gown of deep grey silk that Ottilie Marsh's own niece had sewn for her in secret over the preceding month, plain and unadorned beside 300 guests in silk and diamonds, and utterly unmistakable. She stepped forward from beside the wall into the space between the wedding party and the doors through which Elias Fenn now came walking, silver-haired and grim, with the magistrate at his side, and she said, in a voice not loud but perfectly clear in the room's enormous silence, that she was sorry to interrupt so joyful an occasion, but that there appeared to be certain irregularities in the settlement Mr. Ray had just been reading, which honesty toward the assembled guests obliged her to correct without further delay. Rowan Ashworth, who had been standing near the head of the table with his wine untouched before him, made a sound that was not quite a word, and gripped the table's edge with both hands as though the floor beneath him had tilted. Isolde, in her bridal white, went the color of the tablecloth. The Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth did not move at all, and did not speak, and her face, for the first time in the whole of this story, showed nothing whatsoever, not shock, not fear, not even the practiced serenity she had worn for 3 years, for she alone in that room understood, in the first full second of seeing that silvered streak of hair and those unmistakable grey eyes, exactly how completely and how patiently she had been outwaited. For a long moment, nothing in the dining hall moved at all, not a fork, not a fan, not the flame of a single candle in the great chandeliers overhead, as though the whole room had drawn one breath together and forgotten, collectively, how to release it. Then Mr. Fenn crossed to Seraphine and bowed to her as he had once bowed to her father, deeply and without hesitation. The magistrate bowed also, and Seraphine, standing in the center of her own dining hall in a plain grey gown with her hair loose and a single silver streak marking 3 years no one in that room had troubled to imagine her surviving, turned first to her husband, and said gently that she had a very great deal to tell him, and that she was sorry he was about to hear the worst of it in front of 300 witnesses, but that a room full of witnesses was, in the end, the only place such things could ever safely be said aloud. Rowan took one step toward her. He stopped. His hand rose halfway toward her face and fell again, for 3 years of being told his wife had tried to kill him warred visibly, in that one frozen instant, against 3 years of a grief he had never once, in his heart, fully believed, and the tears that rose in his eyes were the tears of a man discovering, all at once, that the worst thing that had ever happened to him might not, after all, be the thing he had spent 3 years mourning. Mr. Fenn stepped forward with a leather case under his arm, and drew from it a sheaf of papers heavy with seals, and he began, in the dry precise voice of a man who has waited 3 years for exactly this moment, to read. He read first the sworn deposition of the second nurse who had attended Marguerite Calverley in her final illness, a woman named Prudence Hale, who had testified, under Crown protection and considerable persuasion, that she had been instructed by the first nurse, the one personally engaged and personally paid by the Dowager Duchess Vesper, to administer, twice daily, a tonic whose ingredients Prudence had not questioned at the time but had, years later, recognized with growing horror as containing the same rare northern nightshade extract that had very nearly killed the 7th Duke of Marrowgate at his own 10th anniversary ball. A woman near the back of the dining hall, one of the wedding guests, a distant Calverley cousin, made a small strangled sound and had to be helped to a chair. Mr. Fenn paused there and looked once around the silent room, before continuing in the same dry, unhurried voice, as though he were merely reading out a shipping manifest rather than dismantling, sentence by sentence, the fortunes of the family that had once tried very hard to see him turned away from every door in the capital. He noted, for the benefit of the assembled magistrate, that Prudence Hale's testimony had been corroborated in every material particular by the household accounts of Calverley Manor for the relevant winter, which showed a payment, entered in the housekeeper's own hand and never satisfactorily explained at the time, of 11 guineas to a physician's apprentice in the neighboring town for what the ledger called only the Duchess's private compound, a sum considerably larger than any ordinary tonic would ever have commanded, and considerably smaller than the price such an ingredient would have fetched had it been purchased honestly through any licensed apothecary in the realm. He noted further that this same phrase, the Duchess's private compound, appeared nowhere else in 10 years of Calverley accounts before or since, a singularity that a court, he suggested mildly, might find as instructive as any signed confession. Mr. Fenn read next the correspondence in the green ribbon, the very letters Seraphine had found in the estate office 3 years before, which she had that same night, before Isolde's discovery of her, folded small enough to conceal inside the lining of her own glove, and had carried, through fever and exile and 11 months of quiet captivity, until she could place them into Elias Fenn's hands herself. He read the codicil diverting Marguerite's dowry into a trust administered, at one careful remove, by the Dowager Duchess. He read the smaller, more damning letter, found at last only the previous month, in the private papers of the same forger who had once altered a codicil for a fee, and who had, upon being offered a choice between the Crown's mercy and the Crown's full attention, produced a signed confession naming his employer. And he read, last of all, the deposition of an apothecary's apprentice from the capital, who swore that it had not been the Duchess Seraphine who had purchased a vial of northern nightshade extract 4 weeks before the masquerade ball 3 years past, but a lady's maid in the Dowager's own personal service, paying in coin the apprentice now recognized, upon reflection and a great deal of Crown persuasion, as bearing the Ashworth household seal stamped into the purse itself. Seraphine turned at last to face the Dowager Duchess directly, across the length of the great table, and she said in the same quiet voice she had used the whole evening, that she had waited 3 years to say one thing to her, and that she intended to say it now, in front of every guest who had once so readily believed her a poisoner and a madwoman. She said that she did not forgive her, not for Marguerite and not for the wine-glass, and not for 11 months in a hunting lodge, and not for 3 years stolen from a son who had nearly forgotten the sound of his own mother's voice, but that forgiveness had never, in any case, been the debt she had come to collect. She had come only to see the ledger closed in full and in public, exactly as her father had once taught her every true account must eventually be closed, whether the party who owed it wished the reckoning or not. The Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth did not attempt to flee, and did not attempt to speak. She stood very still by the great table, exactly as still as she had stood through 30 years of careful cruelty, and something in her face at last quietly and completely gave way, not into grief and not into shame, but into the flat, exhausted stillness of a woman who has understood, in one single unbearable instant, that there will be no further moves left to make on a board she had believed, until this very evening, was hers alone. Isolde did not stand so still. She began instead to laugh, a thin, high, cracking sound utterly unlike the crystal laugh Seraphine remembered from 10 years of marriage, and the laugh climbed the walls of the dining hall and broke against the painted ceiling and fell back upon her in shards, until she stopped as abruptly as she had begun and turned upon her own new husband, Lord Senet, with eyes gone flat and black, and told him, in a voice that did not sound entirely like her own, that he had married considerably less fortune than he believed, and that he had her sincere condolences for it. Rowan Ashworth crossed the room to his wife at last, 3 years and 1 lifetime of consequence collapsing in the space of a dozen steps, and he did not ask her forgiveness in front of 300 witnesses, for he understood even in his shock, that some things are not owed in public. He only reached her and stood before her and said her name, her true name spoken aloud in that house for the first time in 3 years, and Seraphine, who had survived a broken carriage of circumstance, a poisoned husband, a stolen son, a fever that very nearly finished what the wine-glass started, and 3 years of patient, unglamorous, unrelenting work in a rented room above a Calmore grain merchant's shop, allowed herself, at last, in front of the whole watching world that had once so gladly believed the worst of her, to weep. It took the better part of a year for the courts of the realm to finish untangling the whole of what the Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth and her daughter Isolde had built across nearly a decade of careful, patient theft. The diverted Calverley dowry, the forged codicils, the poisoned wine, the perjured chambermaids who, once granted the Crown's mercy in exchange for honesty, recanted their testimony within the week. Isolde's marriage to Lord Senet did not survive the scandal, nor did Lord Senet's interest in a bride whose family's fortune had just been stripped down to the bare stone beneath it by 3 separate Crown inquiries. The Dowager Duchess Vesper Ashworth was, in the end, permitted by the mercy of a Crown that preferred not to hang a duchess in the public square, to live out the remainder of her days confined to a single remote property in the far north, attended only by servants of the Crown's own choosing and forbidden, by royal decree, from ever again administering so much as a single shilling that was not entirely her own. Rowan Ashworth spent the better part of that same year learning, slowly and with considerable humility, how a man rebuilds trust with a wife he had once, however unwillingly, believed capable of poisoning him. He went, without being asked, to Culmore himself that winter to sit across a table from Elias Fenn and hear, in full and unflinching detail, every part of the 3 years he had not been present to witness: the hunting lodge, the fever, the rented room above the grain merchant's shop, the locked box of unsent letters beneath a floorboard that Seraphine finally, months later, showed to Theo herself, reading them aloud to him one at a time by the nursery fire until both of them had wept themselves quiet. Rowan dismissed Mr. Aldous Penrose from Marrowgate service within the month, though not before the steward had been made to answer, under oath, precisely how much he had known and when, and he had the old housekeeper his mother once pensioned off found and reinstated to her former place, at double her former wage before the year was out. Audley Marsh was brought to Marrowgate that spring at Seraphine's own insistence, installed in a cottage on the estate grounds with a standing pension that would outlast her twice over, and she took, with considerable satisfaction, to instructing the Marrowgate kitchen staff in exactly which remedies a great house ought to keep on hand and which it ought never to trust to any physician who had not first proven his worth at a poor man's bedside. Ivy Marsh, who had smuggled a servant's uniform to a duchess in a scullery passage and waited 2 years for the chance to do it, was made head lady's maid before her 25th birthday, a fact she never once let the rest of the household staff forget. Theo grew, in the years that followed, into a boy who remembered, eventually, quite clearly, the strange servant with his mother's eyes who had knelt beside him at a wedding once and told him that brave duchesses simply waited for the right moment to come home, and he liked, from time to time, to remind his mother of it, and to ask her, with the particular satisfaction of a child who has solved a very good mystery, whether she had known, that night by the tall windows, exactly how right she had been. Seraphine always told him that she had known it the way her own father had once taught her to know a ledger, that every cruelty is an entry, that every debt comes due in its own time, and that the books, however long they are left open, are always, in the end, balanced. Marrowgate Hall itself, in the years that followed, became known throughout the county not for the scandal that had once nearly buried it, but for a small, curious custom the Duchess herself began the winter after her return, a standing invitation, extended every year on the anniversary of her homecoming, for any servant in the household who wished it to sit at the family's own table for one evening, and be waited upon in turn by the Duke and Duchess themselves, a tradition that struck most of the county as faintly eccentric and struck everyone who had ever carried a tray through that house's long gallery as something considerably closer to justice. Seraphine never explained the custom to guests who asked after it, beyond saying only that she had once learned, in a single terrible year of her life, exactly how much a person can see while standing 3 paces behind a lady's chair with her eyes lowered and her face unwatched, and that she had decided, afterward, that no one in her house would ever again have cause to feel invisible in it without her knowing exactly what that invisibility had cost. If this story kept you until the very end, you already know what to do. Press that subscribe button, ring the bell, and tell me down in the comments which moment hit you hardest: the letters in the green ribbon, the boy by the window, or the sound of boots on marble arriving at last. Until then, remember that a ledger only ever looks close to the people who never have to balance it, and that patience held long enough is its own kind of interest. I'll see you in the next one.